Thank you, Mr President. I rise today to speak on this historic piece of legislation. The Greens acknowledge that this is country that was invaded and sovereignty from First Nations people was never ceded. First Nations people were violently dispossessed, had their children stolen, their families separated, their lands, waters and skies stolen and destroyed. Successive governments have perpetrated grave injustices since colonisation, and we recognise its continuance today. This is a First Nations voice bill for the South Australian Parliament. I would also call it a South Australian Parliament listen bill. Listen for a change and engage in dialogue, not just monologue. What is wrong, we must make right. Endemic racism, oppression, misunderstanding, ignorance and the lack of knowledge and education have meant that First Nations peoples have generationally been subjected to policies and legislation that have impoverished many of their lives. The Greens want First Nations people to have self-determination over their country, to prosper and achieve the aspirations that they have for their lives and the lives of their children. We strive for First Nations people to have all they need to live their lives in health, well-being and peace on their lands. It is time to recognise that First Nations people's knowledge and law systems provide the foundation for true self-determination. In 2017, some 250 First Nations delegates and leaders convened at the First Nations Constitutional Convention, a first of its kind. They were there to address their people's institutionalised marginalisation. There, they drafted what is called the Uluru Statement from the Heart, a call to all Australians. The Uluru Statement from the Heart reads, "We gathered at the 2017 National Constitutional Convention, coming from all points of the southern sky, make this statement from the heart. Our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes were the first sovereign nations of the Australian continent and its adjacent islands, and possessed it under our own laws and customs. This our ancestors did according to the reckoning of our culture, from the creation according to the common law from time immemorial, and according to science more than 60,000 years ago. This sovereignty is a spiritual notion. The ancestral tie between the land, or Mother Nature, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were born therefrom remain attached thereto and must one day return thither to be reunited with our ancestors. This link is the basis of the ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. It has never been ceded or extinguished and coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. How could it be otherwise? That peoples possessed a land for 60 millennia, and this sacred link disappears from world history in merely the last 200 years? With substantive constitutional change and structural reform, we believe this ancient sovereignty can shine through as a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. Proportionately, we are the most incarcerated people on the planet. We are not innately criminal people. Our children are aliened from their families at unprecedented rates. This cannot be because we have no love for them. And our youth languish in detention in obscene numbers. They should be our hope for the future. These dimensions of our crisis tell plainly the structural nature of our problem. This is the torment of our powerlessness. We seek constitutional reforms to empower our people and take a rightful place in our own country. When we have power over our destiny, our children will flourish. They will walk in two worlds, and their culture will be a gift to their country. We call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. Makarrata is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle. It captures our aspirations for a fair and truthful relationship with the people of Australia and a better future for our children based on justice and self-determination. We seek a Makarrata Commission to supervise a process of agreement-making between governments and First Nations and truth-telling about our history. In 1967, we were counted. In 2017, we seek to be heard. We leave base camp and start our trek across this vast country. We invite you to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. In 2017, that call went out to all Australians. And Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull called it a third chamber, a call he now admits was wrong, tearfully last year on television, calling for all Australians to now support the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full for voice, treaty and truth. I'm sure he won't be the only Liberal regretting their call in that way. Let's hope that they do so before they leave position of elected authority in the future, rather than once they are safely ensconced away from the green or red leather benches. The Uluru Statement offers a new path built on over 200 years of continuing cultures, activism, survival, resistance and countless failed policies and interventions. The Uluru Statement is a self-determining document that sets practical and meaningful groundwork of how to implement, protect and enforce that self-determination through three key pillars of voice, treaty and truth. To be specific, the Uluru Statement seeks two changes. First, they hope to secure a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. This constitutional recognition would provide First Nations people with entrenched protection to express their desires and needs in Parliament. Second, they seek to establish a Makarrata Commission to oversee agreement-making and truth-telling. Around the country, we are watching unfold the debate for whether we should provide recognition for our First Nations people's voice on a federal level. We have now been given the opportunity here in South Australia to lead by example and ensure First Nations people of South Australia get the recognition and respect from this Parliament that they not only deserve, but the recognition they called for in that Uluru Statement from the Heart. Despite what may have been said, there is strong public support for this First Nations voice. Australians have shown that they are ready to accept the Uluru Statement's invitation to walk with First Nations people in a movement for a better future. From religious groups to peak organisation and cultural bodies, there is a strong united front. I come from a party, the Greens, where 87% at least of our supporters support a voice to Parliament and the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full. I note at least 80% of First Nations, of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians support a voice to Parliament. I note that the No campaign has called for a migrant voice to be included, something quickly countered by the Federation of Ethnic Community Councils of South Australia, who, in fact, support a First Nations voice to Parliament. Indeed, FECA states a fair and inclusive society must start with justice for First Nations peoples. Recognising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the structures that govern this country is essential to self-determination within a fair and inclusive society. There's also been strident support from leaders of at least 10 mainstream religious groups who have demanded immediate action for a First Nations voice to Parliament. These religious groups include the Anglican Church of Australia, the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference, the Australian National Imams Council, the Australian Sangha Association, the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, the Hindu Council of Australia, the National Council of Churches in Australia, the National Sikh Council of Australia and the Uniting Church. In fact, a joint resolution signed by the leaders of these groups declared bipartisan support and action was, quote, necessary, right and reasonable. That resolution reads, there have been many processes and much work completed. There can be no more delay. Our country has wanted and waited too long for justice. Indigenous Australians must now be afforded their rightful place in the Australian Constitution. The work of Reconciliation Australia has also shown that there is consistent public support in giving recognition to a First Nations voice. The Australian Reconciliation Barometer, which is a 2-yearly survey on public attitudes to reconciliation, show in fact that 93% of Australians believe it is important for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to have a say in the matters that affect them. It also showed that 87% of Australians believe it's important to have a First Nations voice enshrined in legislation, both at a federal and state level. This statistic, of course, is echoed by the Greens' support for that, with a Guardian Essential poll showing our support at the moment of 89% of our intended voters. That clear public opinion should be being heard loud and clear right now by the people in this place, but it perhaps shows that we just don't want to listen. I hope that changes. Our country unequivocally lags behind on the right to self-determination, and in particular in the rules of political participation and participation in decision-making in matters affecting First Nations people. On Thursday, the 21st of March 2013, South Australia's constitution was amended to recognise Aboriginal peoples as the traditional owners and occupiers of South Australian land and waters. This amendment acknowledged past injustices and recognised the continuing importance of Aboriginal heritage and culture. The next step, of course, is giving First Nations people a voice in the policies which impact upon them. Although it will be a decade later, I hope that we will finally see an implementation of that systemic change that is long overdue. This bill will help South Australian First Nations people have a voice, a rightful place at the table. And as I've often heard it say by Aboriginal elders, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And we know First Nations people are often on the menu in this place, and certainly just given the scraps far too often. This bill will dissolve the Aboriginal Lands Parliamentary Standing Committee and give those decisions back to people who they will impact upon the most. Historically, there's been numerous bodies established by First Peoples, unilaterally by governments or in consultation with First Nations peoples. However, these bodies have not been properly valued for the potential that they have had to bring about long-lasting change. Here today, we will amend our Constitution Act and recognise this First Nations voice be heard and make a unique and irreplaceable contribution to our South Australian Parliament. I am glad that South Australia is the state leading the charge. I hope that other states and territories watch this journey of our First Nations and our Parliament very closely. South Australia, of course, has led the way in terms of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander reforms and First Nations rights since, in fact, before Federation. A pioneering piece of legislation that we can all be rightfully proud of was passed in this place with the Aboriginal Lands Trust Act. The first ever act in Australia to recognise Aboriginal land rights was assented to in December 1966. That was the first major recognition by any government in this nation in that way. I'm also proud that under a Liberal government, the then Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, Dean Brown, was the first and made us in South Australia the first, following the Bringing Them Home report in May 1997, to apologise to the stolen generations. And we were the first mainland state, of course, to implement reparations for stolen generations with a reparations scheme. And I acknowledge, Mr President, your role in that, and indeed the very cross-party, collegiate manner in which those issues were eventually made real. We were the first in the nation to begin treaty negotiations, with the then Wetherill government announcing their commitment to establishing up to 40 treaties across South Australia. Back when South Australia was what we call a colony, but in fact it liked to call itself a province, we were in fact at the very first session of the Federal Constitution Convention back in March 1897, arguing, under the leadership of Dr John Coburn, arguing that all Aboriginal people deserved the right to vote. 1897 in South Australia. Unfortunately, while we convinced the rest of the country with regards to women being given the franchise, of course we failed in that leadership to convince the rest of the country. But I'll point out we have a proud history here of leading, and it's a history we should be embracing right now instead of somehow having convenient amnesia about. Even under, of course, the previous Marshall Liberal government, South Australia was the first to introduce legislation that would establish a First Nations voice to a state parliament. Indeed, such was the support for it that legislation that was brought forward under the Marshall government was reintroduced under the Malinauskas government by the Liberal opposition. Liberal voters must be scratching their heads today, wondering what on earth has happened in the last 24 hours. From the feedback that the Greens heard, there were concerns about the impact this bill might have on existing agreements the state government has with First Nations people and groups. Part 1, Section 7 provides a protection for native title groups and other bodies who have these agreements in place, confirming nothing in the bill will limit or otherwise affect the functions of any other First Nations persons or bodies. This bill also confirms that we as a parliament recognise that not all people identify as either male or female, and when they nominate for a position on a First Nations local voice group, they will not be limited by their gender identity. This First Nations voice is, of course, only a first step in ensuring that First Nations people in this country and this state reach self-determination. The Greens have always recognised and supported the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full. In fact, we were the first party to do so. That includes not only voice but also entering into treaty and ongoing truth-telling through that establishment of a Makarrata Commission. We follow Victoria in this instance, whose Yurok Justice Commission is indeed Australia's first formal truth-telling process into the injustices experienced by First Nation people. This legislation will be our first steps to ensuring institutionalised change continues in the form of a treaty, and truth-telling will continue to recognise the historic and ongoing contemporary wrongs and address ongoing injustices for South Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. I want to thank in particular and provide some reflections from a man called Eddie Sinnott, a proud Wamba Wamba First Nations lawyer and researcher. He indeed helped the South Australian Greens in our deliberations and understanding of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And he is a spokesperson for the Uluru Dialogue. And I think he put it best when he said, quote, "Voice is the key. It matters for changing the culture and power of decision-making. Despite all of the effort and resource and everything that goes into closing the gap and various different policies, things on the ground aren't markedly improving for Indigenous peoples. It's only right and fair that we have a direct say in those decisions that are made about us." End quote. The Greens have worked with the Voice Commissioner, the Malinauskas government and our communities to make sure that this legislation has the best outcomes for First Nations people in this state. Following consultation with our members and with other First Nations representatives, we did have a few concerns relating to matters including voting mechanisms, a review clause, recognition of the Uluru Statement in full, adequate funding and boundary maps. Our concerns were considered, and I note that we wrote to the Attorney-General about those concerns, and an exchange of correspondence was undertaken and dialogue occurred. And I note that our concerns, having been considered, some are now reflected in the bill itself and some are coming forward in amendments to specifically address these concerns. I also note that I'm a member of the Aboriginal Lands Parliamentary Standing Committee, which I welcome being disbanded by this piece of legislation. It is an oddity, although a product of its time from a well-meaning former minister, to have a cross-party committee of members of Parliament charged with addressing issues of Aboriginal affairs. Surely having people at the table will be more effective than where we sit with that right now. But I also note I'm a member of that committee and called for a briefing to that committee from the First Nations Voice Commissioner, Mr Dale Aegis, and that was delayed and deferred by other members of the opposition on that committee, to the point where, by the time, having had a Liberal opposition member then resign from the parliament and effectively from that committee, by the time that committee was able and willing to hear from the First Nations Voice Commissioner, we were not able to because the bill had been brought forward. I note that there were 6 months where we could have had that briefing and that discussion as a committee with that commissioner. I do hope that the Liberal opposition did avail themselves, outside of that committee opportunity, to take the same briefings, to have the same discussions that I know the Greens had, that I know One Nation had, that I know SA Best had. I do hope that those conversations were in fact undertaken. I do want to also just take a little moment to thank some of the important people who have made this legislation possible. And I do express my deepest thanks to the original Greens of the South Australian Greens, that is part of the Australian Greens First Nation network, the leadership of Uncle Moogie and indeed our South Australian Greens co-convener Bren Saunders, supported ably by our other co-convener Peter Ann Louth, for their wisdom and guidance and their effort to engage. To the inaugural Commissioner for First Nations Voice, Mr Dale Aegis, your enthusiasm and dedication to your work has not gone unnoticed, and we do thank you for leading the extensive community consultations. I thank Greens members in South Australia and constituents and organisations who I've met with and shared their stories, concerns and other feedback, and I do thank the Attorney-General and Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, the Honourable Kye Ma, as leader in this place, for his willingness to maintain an open dialogue and the multiple briefings that he provided to myself and to the Greens more broadly. We have known that this debate was coming to this parliament since 2021. In fact, we've had legislation in this parliament for a First Nations voice to this parliament since 2021. We are here in 2023 hearing concerns that it's all been too rushed. It's quite an extraordinary proposition to claim that. I wish to conclude by saying this, of course, always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So let's now allow First Nations South Australians to have an effective means of participation within this democracy. It is their democracy, and give them that voice they so rightly deserve. It's a voice that will give them the respect they deserve. It is a voice that they have asked for. It is a voice that I would hope the Parliament will listen to, regardless of how we vote on this piece of legislation. In the words of Pat Anderson, Illawarra woman and co-chair of Uluru Dialogue, silence never made history, and history is calling. It is up to all Australians to answer. We call upon the nation to continue walking with us on this final stretch to a better future. And in this walk, it has struck me that something that has often been reflected upon in this debate is that in 1967, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders were finally, some 70 years after South Australia argued in the Federation formation, finally counted, finally seen, but still not heard, still silenced. John Howard dismantled ATSIC almost at the stroke of a pen. John Howard, as Prime Minister, refused to listen. That Bringing Them Home report refused to apologise. And to me, as an MP, that is what the call of the voice is: to listen and to learn, to reflect and to consider, to be better leaders, because we have had more than just our own experience presented to us. To be better than we have been before, and that is that better future that Pat Anderson points to walk together on this path that the Uluru Statement from the Heart has shown us. That path is clearly going to be one that we're going to need to carve out and perhaps won't run as smoothly as we would have hoped in terms of having a lack of bipartisan support. And sadly, in this debate, not one walked on by all in this place. But when it is done, I hope all of us as leaders, when we have a voice, will listen. With that, I commend the bill.
Yeah.